It was good to see the 5 videos went up from before, Andy. They're online now, right, for everybody?
Yeah, let's thank Sage for that. I'll elaborate on that for everyone else. Sage has now posted the videos for, I think, 5 of our 6 or 6 of our 7 sessions so far. And we'll be making the page where those are available to regular attendees, I believe.
Yep, it's all of our sessions except for the first one. We just didn't record the very first session.
Okay. And maybe you could put the link.
Sure. Yeah, if you check the last email for Examine Lives, I added the YouTube page. So all the videos are unlisted, meaning that unless you have that exact link, you can't find it. So really, it's just for us attendees to look back at the archive.
All right. Okay, I think it's time to get going. Welcome newbies and welcome back old timers. Again, my name is Andy Norman and this is Examined Lives. I take it everybody's okay with our recording this session? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, Sage, I think you can click the record button. So our topic today is, are humans fundamentally selfish? And I'm going to turn you guys loose on that in just a couple minutes. Reminders and a couple ground rules about how we like to do things here at Examined Lives. We're trying to create a community of inquiry. So we're deeply committed to a collaborative approach where we hear from lots of people multiple times each, preferably. And we need your cooperation to unlock the full potential of this format. And in particular, I want you all to be co-facilitators of a lively dynamic with short contributions and lots of turn taking. I think we've made nice progress on that dimension in the past, but my own researches on dialogue and collaborative inquiry indicate that we can take it up another level or two if we keep moving in that direction. So again, be clear, colorful, and most of all succinct. We want lots of short, concise observations and 0 long discourses. I've got kind of a fun guideline or mnemonic that I want to share with you that might reinforce this ground rule. I call it the 0.5 principle. So I'd like you to play along with me here for a second. Take your hand. Wave to everybody. Okay, now take your hand and find your mouth and count it. Okay, now take the same hand and find your ears. Okay, count them. All right, now divide the former number by the latter. What do you get?
1.
1. Well, I get 0.5. I get 0.5. I get 0.5, and for me, that represents the relative importance of speaking and listening. Our culture somehow manages to get that exactly backwards and convince us that it's more important to speak well than listen well. I think it needs to be, we need to flip that on its head. And the 0.5 number has a couple of other fun applications. I'd like you to contemplate the following suggestion. Each of us is approximately half as interesting to others as we sound to ourselves. And furthermore, I believe that if each of us halves the length of our average contribution to our discussion, we can double the number of turns that take place within the hour. And I can guarantee that if we do that, we'll more than double the level of energy and engagement. All right, that's just kind of fun, kind of a fun nudge in the right direction. I hope you'll run with it. Okay, so human selfishness. Are humans fundamentally selfish is fundamentally a yes/no question. So I want you to artificially imagine that you have to answer the question with either a yes or a no, and no, nothing else. Now I'd like you to vote. Let's do a quick poll. If you had to choose between yes, we are fundamentally selfish, or no, we are not, which would you pick? Let's see a show of hands. How many of you would say that yes, we are fundamentally selfish? Okay, I'm seeing 5, 6, 7. All right, hands down. How many of you would say, no, we are fundamentally not selfish? Again, about half. I was hoping for a half and half split. That should make for a lively discussion. Very nice. All right, now we can get down into the more intricate and fun prospect of sharing our respective reasons why we answered that question one way or the other, and combining them into a more nuanced picture of human nature. So I'd like to hear from someone from the Yes Coalition. Can one of you, actually could several of you, share your reasons? Again, succinct. Would you be willing to share one of your reasons for answering yes, we are fundamentally selfish?
Well, I think we are not. We were forged evolutionarily to have empathy to others. That's why if I see someone be hurting, I feel the hurt in myself, because we have a mirror, neurological mirror inside that makes us go to help.
All right, very, very good, Andre. Thank you. That's a reason on one side of the issue. Let's go back and forth. How about a reason on the other side? Diane, you need to unmute first. Can you unmute yourself, Diane? There we go.
I'm saying I voted twice because I think humans are fundamentally selfish. And I also think they are fundamentally unselfish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Give us a reason for one or the other of those claims.
Well, I think in order to exist in groups, which we must, we have to be unselfish. And to gain status in groups, we have to be selfish.
Oh, very nicely put and very succinct. Beautiful, Diane. Thank you. Let's hear from somebody else.
I would say I agree with Diane, but I would say it a little broader, that in a lot of the evolutionary neurobiology, we talk about context being the primary variable. So what Diane said is one context, but more micro context or more macro or larger context will determine which dimension will move in the forefront, which one will move into the background, or vice versa.
Nicely said. Anyone else? Kathleen.
Well, I could say something.
I'll be right there in a second. I'm going to let Kathleen go first, and coming back to you.
Well, I mean, Diane made me think when she voted twice, but your question was deliberately not nuanced. You were saying if you had to answer it this way or that way, which would you choose? And I feel like it's the same with human beings. If we have to choose between ourselves and others, what do we normally choose? And so that's why I said fundamentally selfish, although I appreciate the nuances.
Very nice. Thank you, Kathleen. Who was it who also had something to add? Was it David?
Well, I did have something to add. The problem with your question was the word fundamentally.
Say a little more, David. I like it.
Existence precedes essence. It's a duality. You've got to have a double vision, a la William Blake and followers, of what we are. It all depends on context, individual or community.
So perhaps it's misleading to use the word fundamentally in this context on either side of the issue.
Absolutely. You got to reject that right away.
Okay, well said. Let's see. We have a couple other hands up. I know Steve has something to.
It was Jeffrey that had something to say earlier, Andy.
Okay, let's get Jeffrey, and Steve coming back to you. Jeffrey.
Oh, well, I just would say that we have an ego that tries to protect itself and survive. And so that becomes the center of our actions and focuses. And that sometimes involves pro-social activity, but it's a pro-social activity that benefits the self as well.
Nicely said, Jeffrey. And I detect in what you're saying that you see the selfish or self-interest as running deeper somehow than our interest in others. I'd like to pick up on that thread in a minute. Steve, jump in.
I would just preface my remarks by saying I think we finally have proof that election fraud does exist, since Diane voted twice. I think that unlike what David said, that the key to the answer is the word fundamentally. I mean, if you had phrased the question, do we act selfishly or unselfishly, I would have voted twice too. But fundamental connotes to me the primitive. And we begin, I think, both, phylogenetically and ontogenetically, we begin selfish. And empathy and cooperation and altruistic behavior emerges out of that fundamental selfishness.
Wow, nicely put. Alan, what do you think?
Well, I look at this from an evolutionary standpoint, in that it's the species that's got to continue. So that we have a combination of guarding the individual, the self, and also cooperating. It's very difficult to distinguish between the two as being fundamental. And one of the problems that human beings have is that they have many positions to hold at various occasions. So really it does amount to the complexity of the situation and the foresight that you're exercising, whether you're aiming at the present or the future, or maybe you're influenced by the past.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Alan. By the way, I haven't mentioned it this time, but you can indicate a need or desire to speak by using the reactions, by raising your hand. On the newer version of Zoom, that's you'll find that under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, bottom right. And on the older version of Zoom, I think there's a blue hand in the participants window that you can use to raise and indicate it that you have something to share. So feel free to use that, but I'm also going to pay attention to waving when I see it. So John.
Well, before I read E.O. Wilson and David Sloan Wilson and studied the biology of multi-level selection, I used to think of it in terms of the small self with a small s is the isolated self that looks after fundamentally its own interests. And the larger self with a capital S, if we identify with the interconnectedness of the whole human race and all life, then the self is not just us, it's the whole of life that we are behaving in a way that's supportive. So it's really how we identify the self to determine what is the level of selfishness that we're talking about. Selfishness in interest of the whole is not what you're referring to in this question, I believe. Yeah. But with multi-level selection, I frame it much differently now, that we have both and that's programmed into us.
Yeah, and you're right, John, that when people care passionately about larger collectives that they belong to, they identify with those collectives in the sense that they link their identity, their self, to those larger collectives. And so, yeah, nicely put. Andre. You're muted, Andre. You need to unmute. Andre, can you hear me? You remain muted.
I'm an economist and I'm a Jungian analyst also. So I strongly believe in archetypical behaviors. But I worked for marketing for many years. And the context is that we are more selfish or less selfish in the context that we live in. I strongly recommend everybody to watch Adam Curtis' documentary called The Ego of the Century, where he shows how Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, forged this individualism that is very helpful for consumerist society. We have to remember that the United States went out of the Second War untouched. All the other countries were destroyed, and the United States had a huge capacity, capacity. And the marketing tools that this kind of psychological studies brings is to forge individuals more than cooperative individuals like in the East.
Yes. I hear you. Andre, that's a really excellent reminder that, in fact, our level of individualism is culturally conditioned in many ways by the post-war reality. Russell, let's hear from you. Need to unmute first, Russell.
Thank you. So I've lived long enough to be able to have seen examples of selfishness in human behavior. I hate to admit it, but it kind of happens all the time. And I've also been around enough to see that the extent to which people are selfish or group regarding does vary with context. So I kind of am forced to believe that both of those things are true. And in that sense, of course, I resent being forced to yes and no positions. But in fact, I'd like to argue for the the altruistic answer to your initial question, and to do it outside of the context of context. In other words, dealing with fundamentals and evolution, because I think the real question here is, did in fact social connection, group support play a unique role in the evolution of hominins that led to Homo sapiens that did not occur with other great apes, that has rarely occurred with other species of all sorts?
Yes.
That makes people what they are, and that in fact humans would never have become the creatures that we are, who have totally dominated the earth, if in fact there wasn't something unique going on here that in fact had a synergistic relationship with the development of our brains, and that led to, you know, the whole foundation for what we now think of as social neuroscience.
Yeah.
And it's not the same as the genetics that are driving other species.
Russell,
and, you know, and so, you know, I think what's missing in this discussion is the question of recognition of whether in fact there are not biologically evolved, genetically set needs for social connection, and therefore capacities for empathy and for engaging with others that are kind of off the charts relative to other species. And it doesn't, unfortunately, you know, or whatever. I mean, it's part of the dynamic, you know,
Russell,
there isn't selfishness.
Russell, these are wonderful remarks, and I very much welcome the turn towards an evolutionary perspective on this. The answer that I mean, you can find examples of human selfishness and human unselfishness by shifting contexts and placing human beings in different contexts. That much goes without saying. But what the evolutionary perspective gives us is a chance to try to provide a more, perhaps not an essentialist answer, but somehow a more fundamental answer than the kind we're led to by just anecdotal reasoning. And so we've two people now, Russell and Steve, have both spoken to sort of the deep evolutionary forces that shaped us. And yet they've actually evoked those evolutionary forces to support opposite stands on this. If I heard Steve right, he was saying that ontogenetically and phylogenetically, we begin selfish. And of course, Russell, I think, is also correct to point out that we would not be the animal we are if there weren't some pretty significant selection for cooperation and empathy and things of that sort. So what can we do to combine insights like this into a single narrative that sheds light on the deep structure of human nature or human selfishness? Steve, if I might, just to nudge this forward, let me see if I can, I'm not sure I understood Steve's claim completely, but I'm gonna challenge it slightly. Steve, on my understanding, there's a good reason to think that there was a fair amount of selection for unselfishness before humanity even diverged from the rest of the primate. So all primates are to some degree social, and many mammals have a relatively social, I'm sorry, there are at least a class of social mammals that are highly, that rely on a degree of collaboration. So I'm wondering if, although you're correct that evolution does require, sort of starts with selfishness as a default, whether by the time humanity became a distinct species, there wasn't already a significant modulation of that selfishness in another direction. Steve, could you pick that up and run with
Well,
that?
the glib answer is, I think we should all spend a little bit of time around an infant and then come back and discuss this again. I worry that we're really devolving into, as academic discussions often do, semantic issue with the word fundamental. And, you know, if we probably all had a shared definition of what we mean by fundamental, we probably would all, you know, land on the same side of this. You know, I saw a research study cited the other day that was looking at how adults make decisions about fairness in kind of a behavioral economics computer simulation. It was done at the University of Chicago neuroscience lab. And one of the findings, two of the findings that were really fascinating were, one, they found that decisions about fairness for self and decisions about fairness for others mapped on two different neural networks in the brain, not the same, which challenges the whole notion of mirror neurons and the role they play in developing empathy. The other finding they found was they were able to, you know, we're talking about, you know, milliseconds here or nanoseconds, but it was the neural network about fairness to the self that fired first in any of these decision makings. So, you know, I just think however you parse it, whether you look at it neurologically, whether you look at it through Dawkins' selfish gene point of view, whether you look at in terms of how individuals develop, whether you look at it how the species developed, the fundamental beginning block and the first neurons to fire are those that are selfish. Last comment I would make would be, people talked earlier about how the self is identified with larger groups and therefore that engages cooperation. To me, that supports the point of view of selfishness, because the only reason you do that is because yourself is identified with those groups. You know, you would die for your kin, but only because they're you.
All right, thank you, Steve. Velikovsky, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Andy. Well, I was just thinking, everyone's been talking about our sociality, and to Russell and Steve's point, our ultra sociality, which I think goes back to Herbert Simon, 1960. I know one of our early examined lives was on Richard Wrangham and ultra sociality. But Andy, your review of Bregman's Humankind kept and reading the book itself kept reminding me of a quote from ProSocial, the book, that our view of human nature affects the kind of governance that we then design and implement. So I really see the important point that Bregman is getting at, rather than just trying to make us all feel better about ourselves and less selfish and self-serving. If we can sway public opinion so that we see the benefits of altruism, group selection, multi-level selection, it's going to change the way we organize ourselves in our society. And just an aside, I put in the chat, David, Sloan Wilson, myself, and Dean Keen-Simonton tomorrow are giving a talk on multi-level selection and this kind of thing as well.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, just to highlight, I think it's a really important aspect of what Velikovsky was just alluding to there was quite apart from whatever evidence you can amass for the selfish or unselfish view, both of those views have downstream consequences in terms of what we expect from one another, and that those expectations can become self-fulfilling. When we expect the best from each other, often that's what we get. When we expect the worst from each other, that's often also what we get. And so even if it turns out to be not the most evidence-based view, viewing human beings as fundamentally decent and kind might actually be better for us. Let's see, who's been waiting the longest? Help me out here. Let's, how about Andre? Andre, we need you to unmute again.
I have an aunt that is an anthropologist and a highly teacher of politics in São Paulo University. And she says that the human being, the problem is the culture, because we were forced to live in groups of 200 individuals, while ants were forced to live as millions. So we are comparative intergroups and competitive extra groups. But there is some things that it's also cultural. We have an example about schizophrenia, for example. In the West, when people hear voices, these kinds of voices are highly tormented, and the life of the people are an inferno. While in Africa, if you have schizophrenia, if you hear other beings or see other beings, you are highly praised in the group. Yes, so because you have this vision of the other world, and you have all these aspects. So the people are highly valued, and the voices they hear are not tormented.
I hear you, Andre. Thank you for that. Russell.
Oh, my hand has been up just because I never put it down.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, but I will say that last point is certainly directing our attention to culture in an important way, but it is interesting with respect to the diagnosis of schizophrenia itself that it is highly associated with deficits in ability to socially connect and in social cognition, to read other people's emotions and feelings and so on. And that's a problem that interferes with community functioning, and is one of the major reasons that schizophrenia is such a disabling illness. But it's also one that can be remediated through intense socially oriented remediation programs. And in fact, and so there is a question, you know, about what is, you know, the full functional capacity of humans, and doesn't it include the ability to socially connect and so on. And it's, again, I see it as a species difference. It makes us perhaps more like bonobos than chimpanzees,
Yes.
but it's not something that can just be swept away, you know, with you know, interpretations of any altruistic acts as simply being inherently selfish in the way that Dawkins and others have tried to convince people.
Yeah, thank you. I'm fascinated by the challenge of reconciling the truths that Steve and Russell are presenting us with. And I'm tempted to combine them in this way, and I'd love to get all of your thoughts on this. It seems to me extremely likely that the very first nervous systems that ever evolved prioritized self-care. So imagine the first self-replicating organisms, some of whom are kind of programmed to promote their own survival, and others that are not as good at that. Everything we know about natural selection suggests that the initially self-interested critters probably did best initially. Now, as creatures, as life evolves and creatures become more, develop collaborative approaches to problem solving, you need to suppress, I mean, David Sloan Wilson's work on this is very good. You actually need to suppress selfish instincts and develop more empathetic or more sympathetic impulses. And so Russell, I think, rightly points out that, you know, where human beings diverged from chimpanzees, we became far more collaborative than chimpanzees are in much the way that bonobos have. And as a result, we can begin to tell a story where selfishness was the default deep in evolutionary history, and some of the oldest parts of the human nervous system probably prioritize self-care. And at the same time, the human brain has evolved in ways that have added layers that also give a great deal of weight to the care of kin, friends, fellow tribesmen, fellow countrymen, etc. Steve, I wonder, Steve and Russell and others, do you think, does that strike you as a reasonable way of mediating between the views you've respectively presented? I want to hear from Hank.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Here first, okay. Hank, you need to unmute. Blumfarb, we need you to unmute first. Bottom left. We're going to come back to you, Hank, okay?
Okay.
Now we got you. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to sort of try to put it in a nutshell without explaining it and see what people think. Based upon what's being said, does selfishness hijack prosocial aspects of humans or some mammals, or does the prosocial aspect hijack the selfish part? So that's my simple way of coining it and leaving it to think. But I have another question, and I wrote it down, and I don't really know David Sloan Wilson's work, but he talks about, and I'm not a biologist, so he talks about the organism as a kind of a perfectly homeostatic, like you were saying, the earliest organism, and that's where allows him to develop his kind of what matters is prosocial life. Does anybody know much more about it than I've just come across? That's the other.
Okay. Thank you. Two nice contributions. I like both of them. I'd love to hear from someone who hasn't spoken yet. Or anybody. Kathleen, you haven't spoken in a while.
Could the could you repeat the question about David Sloan Wilson, what the question was?
I think that's a question to you, Hank.
Hank, we can't hear you.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure how to phrase it, but Sloan Wilson talks about that the original organism, this is not his words, is a kind of perfect homeostasis. It's not selfish, it's not cooperative, it just lives in its sort of pure form. And that's the construct I kind of looking at with about, you know, as he talks about it, that's what gives him hope about the human condition. And therefore, that's what fuels his prosocial convictions. And that's what's at the bottom of it. That's the way I understand it. I can't say I've spoken to him. You know?
Okay. Kathleen, did you want to pick up on that? Or
I actually wanted to ask you, when you said it might be better for us to view humans as fundamentally decent and kind, could you tell me what you meant by that?
So I'm here channeling the book Rutger Bregman that the Dutch journalist has written recently called Humankind, and he says it better than I can. But basically, he argues that it's both empirically, scientifically wrong to view humans as selfish and depraved, and it's bad for us to think that. That when we think that, we approach one another with more suspicion and cynicism, we trust each other less, and things work out less well for all of us. So if we trade in, and he argues, an empirically inadequate concept of humans as selfish for the much better supported view of humans as deeply collaborative, not only do we get up with a more accurate understanding of the world, we become better capable of navigating the complex social world we live in, if I can offer that as a summary of his view. Diane.
Yes. Well, I'd like to respond to two of these ideas. One of them being David Sloan Wilson's idea of an organism, but the argument that you just presented. I don't think we can legislate how people are going to regard people. This is a much broader social and cultural phenomenon, and it sways one way or another across history. And typically there are groups that are trying to promote cooperation and others that are trying to promote division. So, you know, who wins when is an open question, and a historical question. It's not a fundamental question, actually. We get into talking about persuasion at that point. But to go back to Hank's question, as I understand it, now probably some of you are much more expert on Wilson's writings than I am, but as I understand it, he takes the idea of the organism as the sort of blueprint for life. Now, organisms could be single cell, self-contained, and therefore selfish as organisms, or they could be multicellular, which means that no cell in the organism can be perfectly selfish because it depends for its life on the operation of all the other cells. So each organism in itself is a cooperative mechanism. Now, whether the organism will cooperate with other organisms is a different question.
Yes.
And I'm not able to tell you what Wilson would say about this, but it seems to me that to the extent that organisms are dependent on one another at some level, to some degree, then they are going to have to take the other into account in their behavior. And so, of course, the individual organism wants to survive and wants to reproduce, et cetera, all the stuff that's built into it, that's made life possible for so long. But then at the same time, they have to be sensitive to others, and that means morality. And I think was it Peter that said, maybe, no, Steve Gilbert, saying people should spend some time with babies. Well, you know, what's interesting about babies is that very early, amazingly early, they are sensitive to fairness and to who's a helper and who's a hinderer and so forth. Now, that provides a sort of basis that culture can then build on, educating a child in more sophisticated ways of thinking about morality.
Yes. Diane, thank you. That's lovely. Velikovsky?
Just also wanted to pick up on the earlier point when Kathleen was just asking for some clarity around why is it perhaps a moral imperative to try and think of ourselves and the rest of humanity as selfless rather than selfish. For me, that comes through really clearly in the second chapter of ProSocial, but to use an analogy, Daniel Dennett, when talking about free will, often says it's actually important to believe that we have free will, whether it's true or not, because it's, as you say, Andy, it's the upstream or downstream effects, in this case, downstream effects, consequentialism. If you believe that we don't have free will, it gives you an escape clause to say, well, I murdered that person because I don't have free will. It was my inner robot and machines and evolved instincts that triggered the limbic system into rage. And like a reptile, I decided to just kill the enemy or maybe even eat it. But if you take the conscious view, we are decent, basically. Now and then, of course, it's kind of a bell curve. You bump into a few people who seem to tip the balance one way or another. Ethical versus non-ethical versus most of us hover around the middle somewhere in every single daily action that we may take. But it's actually, I've seen it argued as a moral responsibility to suggest we have free will, whether that's true or not, because you'll take more responsibility for your own actions. And B, if you think other humans, if you force yourself to believe against any evidence you may see that humans are basically good, it has a tendency to force your own conscious behaviors to behave well in return, and watch your own sort of ethics and morals a bit more closely as well. So just thought it's a good analogy with Dennett on free will, this idea of Bregman's and your review saying, why don't we start thinking of everybody as basically a good guy? I'd like to help that guy. He's like me.
There we go. Very nice. Steve.
Geez, where to begin? I feel selfish talking again. I think that this topic is a really good example of motivated reasoning, and that you can come up with your preferred answer to this question depending on how you define your terms. And if you want to define every human being on the planet as one organism, you know, I don't know if that's a reification of a metaphor, but it does allow you to argue that, you know, that somehow we're not fundamentally selfish. The comment I really wanted to make, and I had put it in the chat earlier, is I sort of feel like Alexander Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention. Hamilton, I think, recognized the fundamentally selfish nature of people and thought that a society needed to be built in a way which used that knowledge to create incentives for people to behave in less fundamentally selfish ways. And I put in the chat earlier, I think we can compare capitalism and communism as two economic systems which answered the question which began our discussion in diametrically opposite ways. Communism was based on the idea that we're fundamentally unselfish. Capitalism is based on the idea that we're fundamentally selfish and we need to create certain incentives. And I would say, I think history has answered the question about who was right.
Wow, powerfully argued. I love it. Russell.
I just like to make three points in response to this great discussion. One is about David Sloan Wilson and organisms as fundamental. I see him as making a basic point that it's, in his words, groups all the way down. In other words, even at the cellular level, cells are a cooperative organism that at one point involved the inclusion of mitochondria as the energy factories in cells, and at each successive level of evolution, you have more kind of parts working together. And so his basic argument is not privileging the organism. It's saying that, look, as you get increasing levels of complexity, the parts have to function together. And you can think about groups and larger aggregations in the same way. And so they survive or fail kind of on the basis of how well they work together. Mm-hmm. Now, secondly, about the cultural issue and the implications for behavior. I mean, in his Selfish Gene book, Dawkins makes the explicit point, believe me, everybody's selfish inherently all the way down. And so we need government, we need education to prevent kind of the war of all against all. And it's an approach that says, civilization saves us from being savages, that we really are underneath. And I know selfish gene people like to say, well, it doesn't mean that people are selfish, but Dawkins is actually quite explicit about that. It's a question of, is government the solution or the problem? And the third point, if I could just throw this out there about capitalism and communism, I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because group selection doesn't mean that communism works better. It means that a social forces group in the army works better when it's cooperative. It means that work groups, that capitalist organizations work better if they're more team-oriented, and support people mutually. And whether that goes in one direction or another in an economic system is not determined by, I think it's a real mistake to politicize this difference between, multi-level selection and selfish gene stuff, that it's about, kind of what people need. And if you're not attuned to what people need, to that group-oriented dimension, you're gonna have more problems, and you got to solve them. And a society that does a better job of taking that into account is going to function better.
Thank you, Russell. Fascinating. I love how many persuasive considerations are coming up on both sides of this issue, and that's the sign for me of a question that runs really deep. Andrew, I'd love to hear from you.
I'm thinking a lot, especially I kind of keyed off by the talking about capitalism. I think so much of this, what you even consider selfish, so much of it goes on a continuum that's often has to do with your time horizon. In the short term, you're looking at most things that you would do would be more on the selfish side, but the longer into the future that you're looking, the more it's kind of an enlightened self-interest, where what's best for you is also the best for the group, because you want to be a part of a, of a thriving group. And when the capitalism versus communism thing was mentioned, I do agree that capitalism, it can harness the innovation, it can kind of, play on some of those technically selfish things, but I mean, it's not, it's pretty obvious that it's taken us in a way that in the long run is also, we may not be here in the future if we, look far into the future based on resource depletion, based on global warming, all number of things. So I'm kind of thinking about just in some ways, the evolution of human consciousness and being able to look out farther and plan out farther, being a part of that. And of course, that has to do with your own sense of scarcity, right? Like if you're living in a hostile environment, you're probably, it's not worth investing a whole lot into the future. So you're going to be more short-term focused in a kind of adaptive sense. So
yeah,
I don't know.
Andrew, I love that, in part because in graduate school, I was studying philosophy. I happened to room with a guy who was actually able to demonstrate that your answer to the question, what's good or what's best, is crucially dependent on your time horizon. That what's short-term good is not always what's long-term good. And so I think you add a really interesting element to the discussion by bringing that up. So listen, we're approaching the end of the hour here. I see several hands up, and I want to give Ron and maybe Kathleen each a chance to speak briefly, and then we need to vote on our topic for next time. Ron, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? I'm on my cell phone. I'll be very brief because I'm going into a call on exactly that point. We're trying to save the MBA mind and trying to have them think about all of this from the point of view of building community to serve our needs. So I just want to say that we're on the case, and the point that we're making with our students, we're finding in their hearts, when they look at a system, they go, oh, that's not right. And then they are able to think in a different way. And we're using the pro-social instincts, and Eleanor Ostrom, and moral philosophy and context. Long live John Dewey and the pragmatists. So thank you very much. I'm going on to my next call. Thank you.
All right, Ron, thanks for joining us. Kathleen, would you like the final word here?
Wow, thank you. The word is hierarchy. When we talk about being other related or groupish, it kind of, I keep feeling like it means having empathy and fairness, but we are naturally hierarchical. There can be good reasons for a hierarchy, and there can be a bad kind of hierarchy, but there still has to be some kind of hierarchy. And then, some people don't get the best deal in a hierarchy. And we're not just oriented by empathy, but also fear. I sometimes fear the dean or the college president. I don't always just, want to do things because I'm a good person. I'm joking here. I don't fear them. They're wonderful people. But you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. I do. Wow, I thought this discussion was fantastic. I'm going to leave you with an interesting quote that relates to our topic for today, and then I'm going to ask you to vote on a topic for next time. I ran across this quote just this week. It's from Rabbi Hillel. He writes, or wrote, I guess, "If I am not for myself, who will be? If I am not for others, what am I? And if not now, when?" If you reflect on that, I think you'll find that there's some wisdom packed in there that touches on several things that have been said today. Okay, so as always, we will collectively choose the topic for the coming month. Now you can put this on your calendar for April 15th. We hope you'll join us then. Again, it's 12 Eastern time, April 15th. And here are my suggested topics. I'm going to run through them, and then you'll have a chance to vote. If you haven't already, find the raise hand function under reactions, because that's how I will record your vote. And Sage, you're going to help me count them, right?
Yep.
Okay. Topic number 1, vaccine hesitancy. Why are people hesitant to get the vaccine, and what do we do about it? What does the science have to tell us? Topic number 2, sacred values. Why is it that certain values seem to be treated as sacred, that almost all of us treat core values as something like sacred, something we shouldn't trade off against other things? So what can we learn about that phenomenon by discussing it together? Topic number 3, expectations. What are they? Why do our minds generate them? And do our expectations serve us well? What do we do about expectations that don't serve us well? All right, those are the 3 topics. I'm happy to take one more topic suggestion from the floor if anyone has one that they think would make. Okay, John, what do you think?
This may be too general, but it's conscious evolution, because David Sloan Wilson's work has really provided sort of a scientific underpinning for the spiritual worldviews that recognize the importance of conscious evolution and the whole world ethic, whole earth ethic. So that whole package is really interesting.
Conscious evolution. Okay, very good. Thank you, John. All right, so please get ready to vote for the ones you like. You can vote for as many or as few as you wish. The top vote getter will be our topic for next month. Who would like to discuss vaccine hesitancy? And I'm going to count digital. If everyone can go with digital voting, that would be. All right, hands down, please. Thank you. Topic number 2, sacred values. That one looks popular. Okay, thank you guys. And topic number 3, expectations. What are they and what do we need to know about human expectations? Okay, thank you. And finally, I'm sorry, remind me again what it was, John?
Conscious evolution.
Conscious evolution.
What it is and its role.
Excellent. All right, thank you, everyone. Sage, which is our top vote getter?
Looks like I might have missed 1 or 2, but the margin between values and expectations is like 1 or 2. So maybe let's just take a revote with those as the 2 options.
That sounds good. Okay, everybody now gets 1 vote, and there are only 2 candidates, either sacred values or expectations. Okay, who would prefer sacred values? Okay, thank you. And who would prefer expectations? I think we have a winner in the form of sacred values, but there's enough interest in the other that we can come back to that in a subsequent month. How does that sound? Okay, very good. Hey, and if you're enjoying these, I hope you'll, again, put our next section, April 15th, on your calendar. The following month, I should mention now, we need to meet the second Thursday of May rather than the 3rd due to constraints on my end. So if you're able, put us down for May 13th rather than May 20th for the month of May. All right. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. I love talking with such engaged, interesting, enlightened people, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Hope to see you next month.
Thank you.